The blackness was a living thing, a crushing weight that pressed in from all sides, absolute and suffocating. Pain throbbed in my skull, a dull, echoing counterpart to the phantom skipping footsteps and mocking laughter that had hounded me into unconsciousness. My last sensation was the brutal impact against unyielding stone, the universe collapsing into an even deeper shade of void. How long had I been out? Seconds? Minutes? Time had no meaning in this lightless tomb. My thoughts, sluggish and fragmented, drifted. This oppressive, malevolent darkness, the feeling of being pursued by something gleefully cruel. It wasn't entirely new. A memory, sharp and unwelcome, surfaced from the depths of my battered consciousness. A flashback so vivid it momentarily eclipsed the throbbing pain in my head and the cold dampness of the cave floor beneath me. It was a different kind of darkness, a different kind of haunting, yet chillingly resonant with the here and now. The heavy oak door of the Warrens Occult Museum had closed behind us with a sonorous thud, sealing us into a silence that felt far from peaceful. It was late autumn, the air outside crisp and carrying the scent of decaying leaves, but inside, the atmosphere was thick, cloying, like stale breath held for decades. Ed and Lorraine were still alive then, though their active investigating days were waning. The museum, housed in the basement of their modest Connecticut home, wasn't officially closed down yet, but access was becoming increasingly restricted. We were there on a peculiar consultancy, an off-books request from a nervous collector who believed an item he'd briefly acquired, and which had allegedly once passed through the Warrens' hands, had left a lingering taint on his own collection. He wanted an assessment, an understanding of what kind of energies might be at play, and he'd somehow convinced the Warrens to allow us a private, overnight examination, hoping our more secular approach to investigation might yield different insights. Jaxon Fletcher, paranormal investigator. A title that always felt both too grandiose and too simplistic. My methods were rooted in observation, analysis, the methodical peeling back of layers to find the core of a phenomenon. I sought patterns, causes, even if those causes sometimes defied conventional understanding. Jake Nolan, my partner, was the tech specialist, the logistics wizard, and the indispensable human barometer. His nervous energy, his terrible jokes that somehow managed to diffuse the most oppressive tension, or make it hilariously worse, were as much a part of our toolkit as my EMF meters and thermal imagers. He was already on edge as we stepped into the museum proper. The room was surprisingly small, crammed from floor to ceiling with artifacts that radiated a palpable sense of unease. Shadow-drenched corners seemed to writhe with unseen presences. Each object, from the crudely carved idols to the faded, intense eyes of possessed portraits, felt like a psychic battery, charged with years of fear, ritual, and malevolent intent. Jake made a weak quip about needing a spiritual fumigator, his voice a little too high-pitched. I saw him clutch the small silver crucifix he always wore under his shirt, a habit he'd developed after our unsettling encounter in that abandoned Romanian monastery. It wasn't for faith, he'd once claimed, but for symmetrical weight distribution. I knew better. My own gaze, however, was drawn, almost magnetically, to the far end of the room, to the infamous glass case. Annabelle. Even the name, scrawled in a childish hand on a piece of paper taped to the wooden frame of her enclosure, seemed to whisper. The doll itself was deceptively ordinary. A Raggedy Ann, oversized, with button eyes that seemed too wide, too knowing, and a stitched-on smile that was anything but cheerful. A simple wooden sign warned, "Positively do not open." Charming, Jake had muttered, his attempt at sarcasm falling flat in the heavy air. He busied himself setting up a few wide-spectrum audio recorders and a static EMF detector near the doll's case, his movements quick, almost frantic, a stark contrast to the deliberate way I approached the exhibit. My methodology demanded skepticism, a search for the mundane before even considering the paranormal. Yet, standing before that doll, a profound disquiet settled over me. It wasn't just the stories, the reputation. It was something emanating from the object itself, a cold, predatory intelligence that seemed to observe me with an unnerving stillness. I noted the ambient temperature, the baseline EMF readings. All normal. Yet, the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. We spent the first few hours methodically examining other artifacts, documenting, taking readings. The collector who'd sent us had been vague about the item he suspected, wanting our untainted impressions. The museum was a cacophony of psychic noise, making it difficult to isolate any single influence. There were cold spots that shifted inexplicably, faint, unidentifiable scents, sulfur, cloying perfume, damp earth that would bloom and fade without cause. Jake, despite his initial jitters, settled into his work, his focus on the equipment a familiar anchor for his anxiety. I'd seen him like this before, in crumbling manors where whispers followed us down lightless corridors, or in modern apartments where unseen things threw objects with violent precision. His fear was a constant, but so was his professionalism. He'd once confessed that the routine of setting up gear, checking connections, analyzing data, was the only thing that kept him from sprinting in the opposite direction while screaming show tunes. That strange admission, that blend of terror and absurd coping, was so quintessentially Jake. It was why, despite his often grating nervous habits, I trusted him implicitly. He felt the fear, truly felt it, perhaps more acutely than I allowed myself to, and yet he stayed. He functioned. That, in its own way, was a courage far more relatable than my own often stoic facade. As twilight bled into true night, the character of the museum began to shift. The shadows deepened, no longer passive, but seeming to coalesce, to watch. The silence grew heavier, more intent. We'd decided to focus our attention in shifts, one of us resting while the other monitored. I took the first watch. Jake had unrolled a sleeping bag near the main workbench, claiming the protective circle of our equipment cases offered at least a +2 against spectral assaults. His attempt at humor was weaker now, his face pale in the dim utility light we'd set up. It was around 2 a.m. when the distinct phenomena began to center around Annabelle. I was reviewing audio feeds, the hiss of static a hypnotic drone, when I heard it. A faint scratching sound, seemingly coming from inside her glass case. I froze, listening intently. It came again, delicate, insistent, like tiny fingernails dragging across wood. My EMF meter, positioned near the case, registered a subtle, but definite, spike. I moved closer, my heart rate accelerating despite my efforts at calm detachment. The doll sat motionless, its button eyes fixed, its stitched smile unwavering. Yet the feeling of being intensely, malevolently observed was overwhelming. I could have sworn the temperature around the case had dropped several degrees. A whisper, soft as a spider's tread, seemed to brush past my ear. I couldn't discern words, just a sibilant breath, cold and ancient. I spun around. Nothing. The room was still, Jake a still lump in his sleeping bag across the room. Was I tired? My mind playing tricks? But the EMF meter spiked again, higher this time. Then, a giggle. Faint, childlike, yet utterly devoid of innocence. It seemed to emanate from the direction of the doll, a chilling counterpoint to the earlier whisper. This wasn't the playful, manic laughter of the entity currently haunting my waking nightmare in the caves. This was something smaller, more insidious, like the first hint of a far greater malice. I saw Jake stir, his head lifting from the sleeping bag. His eyes were wide in the dim light, fixed on Annabelle's case. He'd heard it too. He slowly pushed himself up, his face a mask of dread. He didn't speak, didn't make a sound, just pointed a trembling finger towards the doll. In that shared moment of terror, words were unnecessary. His fear, raw and undisguised, validated what I was experiencing, stripped away the comforting layers of skepticism I tried to maintain. He was my canary, yes, but he was also my witness. The presence that confirmed the shadows were indeed moving. The activity escalated over the next hour. Small objects on nearby shelves rattled. A book on demonology across the room slid from its place and thumped to the floor with a startling crash, making both of us jump. The air grew heavy, making it difficult to breathe, as if a physical weight was pressing down on us. We moved as a unit now, Jake sticking close, his earlier attempts at humor completely extinguished, replaced by a grim, focused fear. He monitored the equipment with frantic intensity, calling out readings in a low, tight voice, fluctuations in temperature, spikes in electromagnetic fields, anomalous audio captures. His hands, I noted, were remarkably steady as he adjusted dials and checked connections, a stark contrast to the tremor that ran through his frame. There was a moment, etched vividly in my memory, when a particularly vicious cold spot enveloped Jake. He gasped, clutching his chest, his breath misting in the sudden chill. He looked utterly terrified, his eyes wide with a primal fear I'd rarely seen in him, not even in the face of physical danger. Without thinking, I moved to him, put my hand on his shoulder, intending to pull him away. As I did, I felt it too, an intense, focused malevolence, a wave of pure, unadulterated hatred directed at him, so potent it was almost a physical blow. It wasn't just a generalized haunting. This felt targeted, personal. I pulled him back, out of the epicenter of the cold, my own heart hammering. It felt like it was inside me, he'd rasped later, when the immediate intensity had subsided, his voice hoarse. That was one of the few times his fear had truly found words that night, and in that moment, seeing him so vulnerable, so clearly targeted, something shifted within me. My professional detachment fractured, replaced by a fiercely protective instinct. This wasn't just a case anymore. It was an assault on my partner, my friend. My resolve to face whatever was in this room, to understand it, to shield him from it if I could, hardened into something akin to cold fury. My courage, if it could be called that, was often a stubborn refusal to yield, a grim determination to see things through. But in that instant, it was fueled by something more personal. The absolute necessity of protecting Jake. He was the one who felt these things so acutely, the one whose sensitivity made him both an invaluable asset and a vulnerable target. My role was to be the bulwark. The climax of the night wasn't a dramatic, Hollywood-style explosion of paranormal activity, but something far more insidious and psychologically wearing. The doll itself never visibly moved, never flew across the room, but its presence became a suffocating weight, the focal point of a creeping dread that permeated everything. We began to hear faint, childlike humming, a discordant lullaby that seemed to slither from the very walls. Shadows in the periphery of our vision took on fleeting, grotesque shapes. Reflections in the glass of other display cases seemed to distort, faces appearing for a split second where none should be. We were both on edge. Sleep an impossibility. Jake, despite his evident terror, manned a portable thermal imager, his sweeps of the room methodical, his breathing shallow. It was during one of these sweeps that he suddenly froze, his hand tightening on the imager. He didn't speak, just made a choked sound and pointed the imager's small screen towards me. I looked. The display showed the room in shifting blues and greens, with our own warmer signatures in yellows and reds. But near Annabelle's case, a small child-sized cold spot was visible, a deep blue that was almost black. And within that cold spot, for a fraction of a second, the thermal signature shifted. took on a vague, almost translucent human-like form before vanishing. "Did you?" Jake's voice was a bare whisper. I nodded, my own throat tight. We'd both seen it. A fleeting glimpse of something. It was then that I realized the crux of my own courage, the foundation of my ability to face these things. It wasn't an absence of fear. I felt fear, a cold knot that tightened in my stomach in places like this, when the veil between worlds grew thin. But Jake was the key. His presence, his shared experience, transformed the terror from a solitary descent into madness, into a battle fought on two fronts. His fear, so palpable, so honest, paradoxically gave my own resolve a firmer footing. If he could endure this, if he could function through this, then I had to as well. More than that, I had to be the stronger one, the steady hand, because he relied on that. And in that reliance, in that unspoken contract of mutual support forged in countless encounters with the inexplicable, I found a strength I might not have possessed alone. He was the sounding board for the unbelievable, the confirmation that what I was experiencing wasn't just a product of an overactive imagination or stress. He made it real, and in making it real, he made it something that could be confronted, analyzed, and hopefully survived. Without him, I often wondered if I would simply dismiss the truly anomalous, retreat into the safety of pure skepticism, and miss the very truths we sought. Or worse, succumb to the fear without an anchor. The remaining hours until dawn were a blur of heightened senses, oppressive atmosphere, and the constant wearing feeling of being watched, judged, and found wanting by the myriad of contained evils within that basement. We didn't speak much. There was nothing left to say. We merely endured, side by side, two solitary figures against a tide of unseen malevolence. As the first faint rays of gray dawn began to filter through the basement window, the oppressive atmosphere seemed to lessen, the shadows to retreat slightly. The activity didn't stop entirely, but it receded, like a tide going out, leaving behind a residue of profound unease. We left the Warrens Occult Museum as soon as it was respectfully possible, the rising sun feeling like a physical balm. We filed our report to the collector, a carefully worded document that confirmed his suspicions of a significant, complex, and deeply negative paranormal presence, strongly advising against any further interaction with the suspected artifact or, indeed, the museum itself, if it could be avoided. The museum, as history now tells, did close its doors to the public not long after, whether due to our report or the Warrens' own declining health and the escalating intensity of the phenomena within, I never definitively knew. That night left an indelible mark. It wasn't the most overtly violent haunting we'd encountered, but it was one of the most psychically draining, the most profoundly unsettling, and it had solidified my understanding of Jake's importance, not just as a technician or a partner, but as the very crux of my own ability to face the abyss. He was the human element, the reminder of vulnerability, and in that vulnerability, a strange kind of strength. To lose him, to see him broken as he was now in these lightless caves, was to lose a fundamental part of myself, a part of my own courage. A blinding sting across my cheek shattered the vivid memory, catapulting me back to the crushing blackness and the throbbing pain in my head. My eyes flew open, though sight was useless here. I gasped, disoriented, my hand flying to my face where the slap had landed. Then, a hand grasped my arm, firm, reassuring. Not the cold, terrifying grip of the clown entity, but warmer, familiar. And a sound, a guttural vocalization close to my ear, concerned, urgent. Jake. My mind reeled. Was I still dreaming? Hallucinating from the blow to my head? The Annabelle memory had felt so real, so immediate. The clown, Jake, vanishing. Another gentler pat on my cheek. I strained my eyes, and in the absolute blackness, I began to discern the faintest, almost imperceptible differentiation of shadow. Or perhaps my brain was simply starting to fill in the blanks. Jake's silhouette was incredibly close. He made a series of movements, his hand touching my forehead, then his own, then mimicking a sleeping posture with his head tilted on his hands. He followed this by pointing at me, then making a swirling motion with his finger near his temple, a universal gesture for dreaming or confusion. Finally, he patted my arm again, a gesture of reassurance, then seemed to straighten up, his posture more alert, more normal than it had been in what felt like an eternity. My heart, which had been hammering with the residual terror of the clown chase and the intensity of the Annabelle memory, began to slow. He was trying to tell me I had been dreaming, that the clown, his disappearance, was a nightmare born of my concussion and exhaustion. Could it be? The sequence of events before I hit the wall, the clown's voice, the skipping, being grabbed, felt so viscerally real. But Jake was here now, and he seemed lucid. He shifted, and a faint, almost ethereal glow bloomed beside him. It took me a moment to realize what it was. During our earlier foraging in Pripyat, before the forest nightmare, Jake had picked up a small, novelty keychain, one of those trinkets with a tiny LED light powered by a button battery, clipping it to his pack for emergencies or impromptu finger puppet shows. I dismissed it as another of his frivolous acquisitions. Now that tiny, almost useless light cast just enough of a ghostly radiance to confirm what his gestures had implied. His face, illuminated in the faint, cool white glow, was no longer vacant. His eyes, though still bearing the shadows of our ordeal, were focused, alert. He looked tired, deeply so, and there was a new line of worry etched around his mouth. But the terrifying emptiness, the chilling giggles, the mindless babble, they were gone. He offered a weak, shaky approximation of a smile, a pale imitation of his usual grin, but it was undeniably Jake. Relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed through me. The sleep, the period of unconsciousness after I'd hit the wall, or perhaps his own period of rest while I was out, it must have somehow broken the fever of his delirium, allowed his mind to reset. The alternative, that my recent terrors were purely a hallucination, was both comforting and deeply unsettling. Had my own mind become so untrustworthy? Jake didn't press the issue. He simply squeezed my arm, then made a gesture, a sweep of his hand towards the unexplored darkness of the tunnel, indicating we should move. I nodded, still trying to reconcile the vividness of my nightmare with this new reality. But the immediate, overwhelming fact was that Jake was back. My partner was here, seemingly whole, and that was a lifeline I clung to with desperate gratitude. We continued our slow, painstaking exploration of the cave system. Jake, now lucid, moved with a renewed if cautious purpose. The tiny LED, though pitifully weak, was a vast improvement over total blackness, allowing us to avoid the worst obstacles, to discern the basic shapes of the passages. He held it high, aiming its meager beam, while I once again took point, feeling the walls, testing the ground. His presence beside me, alert and responsive, was an immeasurable comfort, a restoration of balance. The crushing weight of solitude, the terror of facing the unknown with an unraveling partner, lifted. We moved for what felt like another hour, the silence of the caves broken only by our soft footsteps and the ubiquitous dripping of water. Then I felt it, a subtle shift in the air, a faint current, almost imperceptible, brushing against my face, carrying a different quality, a hint of something other than the stagnant, earthy dampness we'd grown accustomed to. It seemed to be coming from a branching tunnel to our left. Jake, his senses apparently sharpened by his return to lucidity, noticed it too, pausing and tilting his head in that direction before looking at me with a questioning gaze. I nodded. It was the first real lead, the first hint of change we'd had in what felt like days. We followed the subtle current down the new passage. It was narrower than some of the others, the walls closing in, but the air definitely felt fresher, carrying a faint, almost metallic tang, and a peculiar underlying hum that I couldn't quite place, felt more than heard. The tiny LED beam bobbed ahead, a small beacon of hope in the immense darkness. After perhaps another 20 minutes of careful progress, Jake, who was slightly ahead with the light, stopped abruptly. He made a soft, astonished sound, his arm shooting out to halt me. I peered past his shoulder, and my breath caught in my throat. Ahead, the narrow passage opened into a vast chamber, and from within it emanated a soft, ethereal glow. Not the pinpoint of an exit to the surface, but a diffuse, widespread luminescence that painted the rough rock formations at the tunnel's mouth in ghostly hues of blue and green. Hope, mixed with a healthy dose of trepidation, surged through me. We stepped out of the passage and into the chamber. It was immense, larger by far than any we had yet encountered. The ceiling soared out of sight into darkness beyond the reach of the glow, and the far walls were hazy, distant shapes. The source of the light was the walls themselves. They were covered in great swirling patches with something that pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence. Vast colonies of phosphorescent fungi, perhaps, or mineral veins imbued with some strange, subterranean radiance, or even, as I looked closer, countless tiny, bioluminescent insects clinging to the rock. The effect was breathtakingly beautiful, an underground cathedral of dim, living light. It was an oasis of sorts in this world of perpetual night. We moved deeper into the glowing cavern, our footsteps echoing slightly in the vast space. The air here was definitely different, carrying that faint metallic tang more strongly, and the low hum was more perceptible. Jake swept the tiny LED around, its weak beam almost swallowed by the chamber's own soft light, his expression a mixture of awe and caution. I scanned the area, my investigator's instincts, subdued by exhaustion and fear, slowly reawakening. What was this place? What created this light? It was, as I was examining a particularly vibrant patch of glowing moss, that I heard it. A soft splish, splash, splish. My head snapped up. The sound was like bare feet, or perhaps something with soft pads, moving through shallow water or across wet stone. It was quick, light, and furtive. Then another from a different direction, and another. Jake had heard it too. He froze, his head cocked, the faint LED beam jittering in his hand. The scampering sounds grew more numerous, echoing faintly from the shadowy peripheries of the vast chamber, just beyond the full reach of the phosphorescent glow. They were all around us, quick, furtive movements, the patter of what sounded disturbingly like many small, human-like feet. We were surrounded. My skin crawled. Cave people? Some isolated primitive tribe that had adapted to this lightless world? Or something else entirely, something born of these strange, glowing depths? The thought of unseen eyes watching us from the deeper shadows, of unknown intentions, sent a fresh wave of unease through me. Suddenly, a sound ripped through the chamber, so loud, so powerful, it seemed to shake the very stone beneath our feet. A deep, booming hoot. It wasn't human, not animal in any conventional sense. It was like the call of some colossal nocturnal bird, or a vast, bellows-lunged creature of the abyss, filled with primal authority and a terrifying resonance. It seemed to come from high up, from the unseen reaches of the cavern's ceiling. The scampering sounds stopped instantly. A dead, ringing silence fell, thick with anticipation. Then, a tremendous crack, like a giant whip snap or a colossal stone shifting, echoed from above, immediately followed by a rushing, sighing sound, as if a great wind was sweeping through the upper reaches of the cavern. And in that same instant, every patch of phosphorescent light on the cavern walls, every glowing insect, every radiant fungus, extinguished. All at once, as if a switch had been thrown. The vast, beautiful, ethereal chamber was plunged into absolute, shocking, impenetrable pitch blackness. We stood frozen, blind, the echoes of the great hoot and the sudden cessation of light still ringing in our ears. The silence that followed was a crushing weight, made heavier by the knowledge that we were not alone. The scampering things were still out there in the dark with us, silent now. And above, the entity that had commanded the darkness, the source of that terrifying hoot, remained an unseen, unknown, and infinitely more powerful presence. The faint hum of Jake's tiny LED was a forgotten memory, its battery long dead. We were back where we started, in the dark, hunted and terrifyingly vulnerable.